If you are a real estate investor in the United States, you may be thinking to yourself, wow, I should have purchased property in Florida, Arizona, or Texas after the Great Recession. As employment and population expanded in these low cost of living, business-friendly states, real estate values increased substantially from recession lows. However, climate change may be flipping the script on many of these regions that have had almost everything going for them over the past decade. Sea levels and average temperatures are rising, droughts and floods are more common, and extreme weather events are seen more regularly. Is a watershed moment right around the corner? One that will see substantial migration changes and a substantial rebalancing of property values? A number of scientists and economists think the United States may see a mass climate change-driven migration toward the Great Lakes, a region of the United States that has recently been out of favor but was once a major economic center for the nation. Could cities such as Detroit, Buffalo, Cleveland, and Milwaukee be in line for an economic revitalization? Prior to discussing the appeal of the Great Lakes, it is helpful to understand some of the climate change-driven problems that parts of the nation currently face. The most at-risk areas can generally be broken out into two categories: areas that are affected by droughts and areas that are affected by flooding. First, let's take a look at some of the regions affected by drought conditions. You may have seen numerous headlines over the past years of the massive wildfires in the western part of the country. Well, droughts are largely to blame for the increased frequencies of these wildfires. California, despite a rare instance of flooding in early 2023, can serve as a case study to show how the drought and wildfire risks have worsened over time. While California has not necessarily experienced more wildfires, the wildfires are larger, more severe, and last longer, greatly increasing the total amount of land area burned per year. For example, 9 of the 10 most extreme fires in California's history have occurred within the past decade, and the fire season is now 2.5 months longer than it was in 1970. The economic impacts of droughts are massive. In the Midwest, water has dropped to record low levels on the Mississippi, Missouri, and Ohio rivers, which has impeded boats and shipping lanes. Additionally, in 2022, the National Integrated Drought Information System identified southern Missouri, Kentucky, southern Illinois, southern Indiana, and northern Iowa as areas where drought has most rapidly increased, regions that largely depend on agriculture for their livelihood. Dried out soil is largely impacting the farming process, leading the U.S. Department of Agriculture to lower its projected yield of wheat, corn, and soybeans. On the other end of the spectrum, but also driven by climate change, let's take a look at flooding. Flooding is becoming more frequent along the coastal regions of the United States. A study by the EPA found that across 33 selected coastal cities, over 11 times as many flood events occurred from 2010 to 2020 compared to 1950 to 1960. This is partially driven by an increased frequency of extreme weather events that have hit the coast. Not only does this affect the quality of life and possible damage to the residents' property, but insurance costs are skyrocketing in some of the most affected areas, making certain areas unaffordable for longtime residents. For example, homeowners in Florida pay the highest insurance premiums in the country, totaling about 3 times the national average. Unfortunately, the pricing situation will only get worse. According to the Insurance Information Institute, those already high prices are rising at about 33% per year on average, much higher than the national projection of about 9% per year. So, will there be a point when residents in these drought and flood susceptible areas decide enough is enough? Either they are tired of the risks of fire and flood, or they cannot afford to stay due to the effects on the local economy or the insurance premiums? Now, let's take a look at the region poised to welcome these residents should they decide to move. The Great Lakes region is generally used to describe portions of 8 U.S. states and the Canadian province of Ontario that border 5 interconnected freshwater lakes known as the Great Lakes. The region was once the nation's premier economic and industrial shipping center thanks to its navigable waterways and access to the Atlantic Ocean through the Erie Canal. As the U.S. economy shifted away from a focus on manufacturing, population and economic growth in the region began to slow. However, the region still possesses premier transportation infrastructure and the capacity for additional population. So what are the aspects that make this region a prime recipient for climate migrants? The Great Lakes possess 84% of North America's supply of fresh water and 21% of the world's supply of fresh water. In a future that sees more intense droughts, what resource will become more valuable and therefore draw climate migrants? You guessed it, fresh water. Not only is the Great Lakes region relatively less susceptible to flooding compared to other parts of the country, but the region may be of particular interest to Atlantic coast residents who wish to escape the yearly threat of hurricanes. Additionally, the forests in the Great Lakes region are less susceptible to forest fire and more climate change resilient compared to other forests in other parts of the nation. Lastly, and perhaps not on a positive note, rising annual temperatures will lead to milder winters in the Great Lakes region, providing for a more hospitable year-round climate for residents. Certain cities and institutions in the Great Lakes region have already started to think about how to handle this potential migration. For example, Buffalo has hired a climate action manager, and one of her first tasks has been to figure out how to prevent existing residents from displacement should an influx of climate migrants move to the city and spur economic growth. Also, the University of Michigan has been exploring the best way to plan for climate change migrants. Several staff members are developing web-based tools to help city planners, engineers, and policymakers easily envision these migration scenarios and plan accordingly. No one can reasonably predict how exactly climate change will play out, but one cannot ignore the fact that substantial changes are already underway. At a certain point, residents of the climate-affected areas will decide to move, and the Great Lakes region has a great appeal for these residents and tailwinds for climate change resilience.